The energy in their communications reminded me of athletes preparing for a championship game, rather than soldiers facing certain death. There was tension, certainly, but it was the focused tension of performers about to take the stage, not the despair of the condemned. They checked and rechecked systems with the meticulous care of concert musicians tuning their instruments before a performance. Then Commander Anderson's voice cut through the chatter with complete calm. The casual academic debates ceased immediately, replaced by perfect silence across all channels. His order wasn't delivered with dramatic emphasis or heroic bravado. It came with the matter-of-fact tone of a conductor signaling the orchestra to begin. All vessels, execute Pattern 7 on my mark. The command that would force me to rewrite 17 years of observational protocols was delivered with less emotion than most species use to order lunch. Look, I've seen coordinated fleet maneuvers across 17 systems. Nothing in my observational training prepared me for Pattern 7. When Commander Anderson calmly said, "Execute Pattern 7 on my mark," I expected some desperate suicide run. That's usually what happens when outnumbered forces make their final move. They try to take as many enemy ships with them as possible in one glorious, futile blaze. The tactical manuals call it terminal offensive posture, and it typically results in complete annihilation with minimal enemy losses. Instead, the 12 human ships began moving like parts of some organic whole. They didn't accelerate or turn like individual vessels, they flowed. Their movements achieved perfect synchronization without any visible communication between them. No command updates, no coordination signals. They just moved together like a school of fish changing direction instantaneously. Each ship seemed to anticipate the other's movements through some unspoken understanding that defied all known military coordination protocols. They wove through the hegemony formation like water, flowing through rocks. Enemy vessels fired volley after volley of plasma beams that should have vaporized them, but the human ship slipped between the energy bursts with impossible precision. The Defiance actually threaded its entire hull through a gap between two converging plasma streams that left less than 3 meters clearance on either side. That kind of navigation shouldn't be possible with current propulsion technology. It defied physics as I understood them. Their movements appeared almost choreographed, like some deadly ballet performed in vacuum. Ships would rotate and accelerate in patterns that created overlapping fields of fire while maintaining perfect defensive positioning. They used each other's momentum, gravitational shadows, and even the enemy's weapons fire to enhance their maneuverability. One cruiser actually used the explosive debris from a near miss to adjust its trajectory without expending thrusters. This wasn't centralized control. That much became immediately clear. No command ship could process tactical data quickly enough to coordinate such precise movements across 12 vessels. They weren't following orders so much as responding to some shared tactical consciousness. Each pilot operated with complete autonomy, while somehow maintaining perfect harmony with the entire fleet. The coordination happened at a level below conscious command. Instinctual, instantaneous, and impossibly precise. They avoided enemy fire without traditional evasive maneuvers. Most species try to dodge incoming weapons fire by changing velocity or direction abruptly. The humans didn't dodge. They positioned themselves where the shots wouldn't be. They maneuvered into the blind spots of enemy targeting systems, used other ships as temporary shields, and even timed their movements to coincide with the hegemony's weapon recharge cycles. It was like watching someone navigate a rainstorm without getting wet by standing, where the drops haven't fallen yet. The entire engagement transformed, from military confrontation into something between art and science that the galactic military manuals had no category for. This wasn't combat as we understand it. It was spatial manipulation on a tactical level. They weren't fighting the hegemony fleet so much as demonstrating their complete mastery of three-dimensional combat geometry. The precision required to maintain these formations while under fire exceeded anything in recorded galactic history. What made Pattern 7 so revolutionary wasn't just the coordination. It was the complete reimagining of space combat doctrine. They proved that fleet actions could achieve strategic objectives through positioning and movement, rather than sheer firepower. Their maneuvers created tactical advantages through geometry, rather than weapon superiority. They demonstrated that the best defense wasn't stronger shields but better positioning. This revelation forced me to reconsider everything I thought I knew about military engagements. The established principles of mass, velocity, and firepower suddenly seemed primitive compared to this new approach. The humans had developed something that existing tactical frameworks couldn't adequately describe or counter. They had moved beyond conventional warfare into something that blended physics, psychology, and group dynamics in ways we're still struggling to comprehend. Which brings us to the moment the first dreadnought went completely silent. Not destroyed, not damaged in the conventional sense, just rendered completely inactive without a single explosive decompression or system failure alert. The massive warship simply stopped responding to commands, its weapon systems going offline, its engines powering down, its communications falling silent. The hegemony's most powerful asset had been neutralized without firing a single shot in its own defense. You know how most species fight? Maximum force, total destruction, overwhelming firepower. The standard galactic approach to space combat involves targeting the biggest, most explosive components first. Reactor cores, ammunition storage, power conduits. Hit the things that make the biggest explosions when they explode. It's not sophisticated, but it's effective. And it's how every military force from the spiral arm to the outer colonies has conducted warfare for centuries. The mathematics of destruction are simple. More energy applied to more vulnerable systems equals faster victory. The human ships had perfect firing solutions on every critical system in the hegemony fleet. They could have targeted reactors that would have chain reacted through entire dreadnoughts. They had clear shots at ammunition stores that would have turned battlecruisers into momentary suns. Bridge modules, life support systems, primary weapon arrays, all the standard kill shots were available and vulnerable. The tactical computers would have been screaming targeting solutions that promised maximum destructive efficiency. Instead, they fired precisely at engine nacelles, navigation arrays, and communication clusters. Their weapons fire looked surgical rather than explosive. Each shot disabled systems without destroying ships, without killing crews, without creating the kind of spectacular debris fields that characterize normal space combat. They targeted the connections between systems rather than the systems themselves. Power transfer conduits, data relay networks, thruster control interfaces. The kind of components that render a warship helpless without actually destroying it. The Defiance landed targeted shots that rendered entire dreadnoughts immobile, but structurally intact. Their weapons didn't punch through armor. They slid between armor plates to strike exactly the right components. One shot would disable primary thrusters while leaving backup systems untouched. Another would knock out long-range communications while preserving internal ship networks. They dismantled the hegemony fleet like technicians disassembling machinery, rather than soldiers destroying enemies. Each disabled ship remained perfectly habitable, completely functional in every way except its ability to wage war. This precision required understanding enemy ship design better than the builders themselves. The humans knew exactly where to strike to disable systems without triggering catastrophic failures. They understood the backup systems, the redundant networks, the emergency protocols better than the engineers who designed them. Their targeting showed familiarity with every design iteration, every modification, every weakness that the hegemony thought they had concealed. They didn't just know where to hit the ships, they knew exactly how much force to apply to achieve specific levels of disablement. The degree of control they demonstrated was unprecedented. Most weapons either destroy or they don't. There's not much middle ground in energy weapons technology. The humans had somehow developed firing protocols that could disable systems with surgical precision. Their beams could sever specific data connections without damaging adjacent power lines. They could knock out sensor arrays without affecting weapon systems. This wasn't just better targeting. This was a completely different approach to weapons technology. They were performing what humans call non-lethal dismantling of capabilities. This wasn't about destroying the enemy. It was about removing their ability to fight while preserving everything else. The ships, the crews, the infrastructure, all remained intact, just temporarily removed from the battlefield. The humans weren't trying to win through superior destruction. They were demonstrating superior control. They proved they could end the conflict without a single casualty, if the enemy cooperated. At the time, I thought it was tactical insanity. Why leave functional enemy ships floating in space when you could eliminate them permanently? Why preserve combat-capable vessels that might be repaired and used against you later? This approach seemed recklessly optimistic, dangerously naive for a species facing annihilation. The professional observer in me started compiling notes about human psychological limitations in combat situations. I assumed this was some sort of cultural constraint that prevented them from taking necessary decisive action. Then I saw what came next, and I realized this wasn't limitation. It was something far more sophisticated. The preservation of enemy assets wasn't accidental or reluctant. It was intentional, calculated, and part of a larger strategic framework that I was only beginning to understand. The humans weren't just winning a battle, they were setting up the entire post-conflict scenario in real time. Their surgical strikes weren't about avoiding destruction. They were about controlling what happened after the shooting stopped. Look, when you disable an enemy fleet, standard procedure is to eliminate survivors and claim victory. Galactic military doctrine is very clear on this point. You don't leave functional enemy assets floating in space where they might recover and counterattack. The established protocol calls for systematic elimination of all combat-capable elements before proceeding to occupation or negotiation phases. Every species I've observed follows some variation of this principle, from the meticulous Crystal Collective to the brutal Shard Empire. You secure your victory by making sure the enemy can't challenge it later. As the hegemony ships drifted powerless through the engagement zone, the humans did something that made me check my instruments twice. I actually recalibrated my sensors because the readings made no tactical sense. Instead of moving in for the final elimination, human shuttles began deploying from their vessels and heading toward the disabled hegemony ships. These weren't boarding parties armed for combat. They were marked with medical symbols and carried engineering teams instead of marine contingents. The tactical displays showed friendly vessels approaching hostile assets without weapons hot, which violated 17 different standing operational protocols. They began offering medical care, emergency power, and basic repairs to the ships they'd just disabled. Human medics crossed over to enemy vessels using emergency docking procedures to treat wounded crew members from both sides. They brought medical supplies and equipment, setting up temporary treatment stations right there in the enemy's medical bays. Meanwhile, engineering teams worked on restoring limited life support and communications to ships that moments before had been trying to destroy them. They prioritized systems that kept crews alive rather than systems that restored combat capability. This assistance wasn't random or discretionary. It followed detailed protocols that appeared in their operational manuals. They had standard procedures for providing aid to disabled enemy vessels, complete with checklists and resource allocation guidelines. The human teams operated with the same precision they'd shown in combat, just applied to preservation rather than destruction. They assessed each ship's needs, prioritized based on urgency, and deployed resources accordingly. Some vessels received emergency power transfers. Others got life support system repairs. Others required medical evacuation support. The degree of coordination in their humanitarian response matched their combat coordination. Medical teams knew exactly what supplies each ship needed based on damage assessments. Engineering teams brought compatible replacement parts for hegemony systems. They even had translation software that worked with enemy communication systems to coordinate the aid efforts. This level of preparation suggested they'd anticipated providing assistance to defeated enemies as part of their standard operational planning. Commander Anderson framed this aid as part of their victory strategy, rather than afterthought compassion. In his communications with both fleets, he presented the assistance as a logical extension of their tactical success. He explained that preserving enemy lives and assets strengthened their strategic position rather than weakening it. This approach treated mercy as a tactical advantage rather than a moral luxury. The humans viewed helping their defeated opponents as the most efficient way to secure lasting victory. This integration of compassion into military doctrine represented a complete departure from established galactic norms. Most species treat mercy as something separate from combat operations, something you might show after securing absolute victory, if resources permit. The humans built it directly into their engagement protocols from the initial planning stages. Their tactical computers calculated humanitarian needs alongside combat requirements. Their logistics chains included medical supplies for enemy casualties. Their training incorporated cross-species emergency response techniques. They were demonstrating that strength could include compassion rather than require cruelty. The humans proved that military superiority didn't have to manifest through overwhelming destruction. They showed that you could achieve complete tactical victory while preserving life and minimizing suffering. This approach challenged the fundamental assumption that effectiveness in conflict requires maximum application of force. They redefined victory as not just defeating your enemy, but doing so in a way that creates better conditions for everyone involved. The professional observer in me started reconsidering all my previous assessments of conflict resolution. I'd always measured military effectiveness by destruction ratios and casualty counts. The humans introduced new metrics: preservation of life, minimization of suffering, restoration of functionality. They evaluated their success not just by what they destroyed, but by what they preserved. This shifted the entire framework for assessing tactical outcomes, which brings us to the old human saying that reframed everything I thought I knew about warfare and conflict resolution. Commander Anderson would eventually share this philosophical foundation that explained why they helped those who had tried to destroy them, and it would force me to completely reconsider 17 years of observational data. You know, when I finally asked Commander Anderson why they didn't simply destroy their foes, he smiled. Not the triumphant smile of a victor gloating over his defeated enemy, but the patient smile of someone explaining basic arithmetic to a slow student. He leaned back in his command chair, the battle system still displaying the disabled hegemony fleet, and quoted something called an old human saying that apparently dates back to their pre-space age. The phrase felt strangely archaic coming from someone who had just revolutionized space combat doctrine. "Violence is the last refuge of the incompetent," he said, and then added with that dry human humor, "We've spent most of our history proving that saying wrong." The statement hung in the air between us, challenging 17 years of observational data and centuries of galactic military doctrine. Here was a military commander who had just achieved one of the most lopsided victories in recorded space combat history, suggesting that his entire species had been failing at conflict resolution for millennia. He explained that humans trained to minimize harm while maximizing resilience, which sounded like contradictory objectives to someone raised on clear galactic combat protocols. Their military philosophy argued that destroying enemies just creates new enemies among survivors, turning tactical victories into strategic liabilities. This wasn't some abstract ethical position. It was practical mathematics applied to conflict resolution. They'd calculated that every destroyed ship created dozens of vengeful crew members. Every killed soldier left grieving families. Every orbital bombardment seeded future rebellions. This wasn't pacifism. They called it strategic empathy, integrated directly into combat doctrine. The term sounded oxymoronic to my training, like aggressive kindness or violent compassion, yet their actions had demonstrated precisely that combination. They'd studied how to defeat bullies without becoming bullies themselves, which apparently involved extensive psychological research into conflict escalation patterns. Their tactical computers didn't just calculate firing solutions. They modeled post-conflict political landscapes and long-term relationship trajectories. They viewed military engagement as just one tool in a broader strategic toolkit, not the ultimate solution to every problem. Their approach involved understanding enemy motivations, cultural contexts, and political pressures better than the enemies understood themselves. This allowed them to apply precisely measured force that changed behavior without creating lasting resentment. They'd essentially weaponized psychology and sociology, turning social sciences into combat multipliers. The concept that strength didn't equal cruelty, and defeat didn't justify revenge, shook my professional foundations. Galactic military theory is built on clear cause and effect relationships. Apply force, achieve results. The human approach introduced feedback loops, secondary effects, and long-term consequences into the equation. They measured success not by immediate tactical outcomes, but by sustained strategic advantages that persisted generations after the conflict ended. Their philosophy represented a complete inversion of standard power dynamics. Instead of demonstrating strength through the ability to destroy, they demonstrated strength through the ability to control outcomes without destruction. Instead of measuring victory by how completely they defeated their enemy, they measured it by how effectively they transformed their enemy into something less threatening. This required far more sophisticated planning and execution than simple overwhelming force. At the time, I thought it was idealistic nonsense, the product of a younger species that hadn't yet faced the harsh realities of galactic politics. a temporary philosophical phase they'd outgrow once they encountered truly determined adversaries. The professional observer in me started drafting notes about human cultural development stages and predicted they'd adopt more conventional approaches after a few more conflicts. Then I witnessed the therapeutic conversation that followed, and I realized this wasn't idealism. It was something far more radical and sophisticated. The humans weren't just applying new tactics. They were operating from a completely different framework for understanding conflict itself. Their approach to the post-battle discussion would force me to question whether any of us truly understood how to resolve differences between species. Look, I've recorded thousands of post-battle transmissions across 17 systems, and they all follow predictable patterns. You get threats, boasts, surrender terms, demands for better treatment, the usual emotional fallout of violent conflict. Most species either rage against their defeat or beg for mercy with varying degrees of dignity. The conversations typically involve power dynamics, resource allocation, and political consequences. They're transactional exchanges between victor and vanquished, not philosophical discussions about the nature of conflict itself. The conversation between Commander Anderson and Admiral Korath sounded like some interspecies therapy session rather than a military debrief. Anderson sat calmly while Korath initially radiated fury through the communication link, his body language screaming imperial outrage. The human commander listened with what I could only describe as genuine compassion, letting the admiral exhaust his anger before responding. This patience alone was unusual. Most victors either interrupt or escalate when faced with defeated aggression. They began dissecting the assumptions behind imperial aggression and defensive violence like academics debating theoretical physics. Anderson guided Korath through examining why the hegemony felt compelled to attack weaker species, what fears drove their expansionist policies, how their military doctrine had evolved from specific historical traumas. This wasn't accusation. It was clinical analysis of behavioral patterns. They discussed psychological triggers, cultural narratives, and economic pressures as factors in conflict initiation. Anderson explained that their goal wasn't revenge or conquest, but to deliver a simple message: find someone else to pick on. The statement sounded almost childish coming from someone who had just disabled a superior fleet, yet it carried profound strategic weight. He framed their entire military engagement as a corrective measure rather than punitive action. This shifted the conversation from traditional victory terms to behavioral modification objectives. Korath's fury gave way to helpless confusion as the discussion progressed. You could see him struggling to process how a smaller species could nullify an empire's military capability without destroying it. His entire understanding of power dynamics was based on capacity for destruction, and here were humans demonstrating superior capability through restraint. The cognitive dissonance visibly unsettled him. His tactical training offered no framework for understanding this approach. The human commander framed their victory as altering the balance of power through restraint, which sounded like philosophical wordplay until you saw the disabled but intact hegemony fleet floating around them. Anderson explained that true strength involved controlling outcomes without maximal force, achieving objectives without unnecessary destruction. This concept challenged centuries of military doctrine that equated power with destructive capability. They were offering the hegemony fleet safe passage home after ensuring Earth would no longer be a target, which overturned every standard protocol for dealing with defeated enemies. The humans provided repair assistance, medical support, and navigation coordinates for the return journey. This generosity wasn't conditional or negotiable. It was presented as the logical consequence of their victory. They treated the defeated fleet as misguided rather than evil, as potential allies rather than permanent enemies. This entire exchange represented conflict resolution as psychological intervention rather than military conclusion. The humans were addressing the root causes of aggression rather than just the symptoms. They viewed warfare as conversation rather than annihilation, using tactical superiority to create conditions for meaningful dialogue. This approach required understanding your opponent better than they understood themselves, identifying their fears and motivations more clearly than their own psychologists could. The conversation lasted hours, with Anderson patiently guiding Korath through examining his species' behavioral patterns and strategic assumptions. They discussed historical precedents, economic pressures, cultural narratives that drove expansionist policies. The human commander presented alternative approaches to security that didn't require subjugating other species. He offered insights into conflict resolution, techniques that the hegemony had never considered. This therapeutic debrief revealed the deeper philosophy behind human tactics, the idea that military engagement should serve psychological and strategic transformation rather than simple domination. They weren't just winning battles. They were changing how other species thought about conflict itself. Their approach treated warfare as a failure of communication that required correction rather than punishment. Which brings us to the paperwork that would change the galaxy, because of course the humans had documentation requirements for this entire process. Their approach wasn't just tactical improvisation. It followed established protocols that needed proper recording and analysis. The extensive reports they generated would eventually force the entire galactic community to reconsider how we handle interspecies conflict. You know, galactic observers file standardized reports. Form 12C for routine planetary subjugation runs exactly 3 pages with convenient checkboxes for orbital bombardment confirmation and surrender documentation. The system prefers concise, quantifiable data that fits neatly into existing analytical frameworks. My report on the human engagement ran 847 pages and required 3 supplemental data crystals just for the raw sensor logs and communication transcripts. The documentation requirements alone would have overwhelmed most observation posts. Administrative capacity. The official stance that emerged from my analysis was that the galaxy must study human conflict resolution techniques as a matter of urgent priority. This wasn't some abstract recommendation buried in the appendices. It formed the central thesis of the entire document. The report argued that human philosophy could fundamentally shift galactic power dynamics from conquest toward mediation, presenting evidence that this approach offered more sustainable long-term stability than traditional military domination. I documented everything, from Pattern 7's coordination algorithms to their post-battle humanitarian protocols with painstaking detail. The tactical analysis section alone covered 300 pages of maneuver diagrams and synchronization patterns that defied existing combat doctrine. Another 200 pages examined their medical assistance procedures for enemy combatants, complete with cross-species compatibility charts and treatment protocols. The psychological analysis of their command decisions required entirely new assessment categories that don't exist in standard observation manuals. This wasn't just another battle analysis to be filed. Alongside countless other engagement reports, it represented a blueprint for reimagining interspecies relations based on demonstration rather than destruction. The document showed how military superiority could be exercised through restraint rather than overwhelming force, how tactical victories could create diplomatic opportunities rather than breeding resentment. It presented an alternative to the endless cycle of revenge and retaliation that characterizes most galactic conflicts. My superiors initially thought I'd suffered some kind of observational psychosis brought on by extended deep space duty. The division chief actually ordered a mandatory psychological evaluation, convinced that no species could achieve what the reports described without some form of sensor malfunction or observer delusion. The entire Strategic Analysis Division reviewed the data with increasing skepticism, questioning how a species with limited spaceflight experience could revolutionize conflict resolution so completely. The evidence eventually became undeniable. Humans had demonstrated something the galaxy desperately needed, whether we recognized it or not. The sensor logs showed their precision targeting systems disabling ships without destruction. The communication transcripts revealed their philosophical approach to conflict as conversation rather than annihilation. The aftermath documentation proved their commitment to preservation over punishment. Every piece of data supported the same revolutionary conclusion. The report's impact stemmed from its comprehensive challenge to established military doctrine. It didn't just present new tactics. It questioned the fundamental assumptions behind how species interact during conflicts. It argued that true strength involves controlling outcomes without maximal force, that victory can be measured by what you preserve rather than what you destroy. This perspective forced the entire analytical division to reconsider centuries of accepted wisdom about power dynamics and conflict resolution. At the time, I thought the report would be filed and forgotten like so many other observational anomalies. The bureaucratic machinery of galactic governance tends to absorb revolutionary ideas without actually implementing them. The human engagement seemed too radical, too contrary to established practices, too demanding of systemic change to actually influence policy. I expected polite acknowledgments followed by gradual institutional forgetting. Then the diplomatic mission launched, and I realized this wasn't going to be another ignored report gathering digital dust in the archives. The coalition assigned actual resources, deployed specialized personnel, and committed serious political capital to understanding what the humans had demonstrated. What began as routine observation duty was transforming into something that might actually change how the galaxy handles conflict. Look, most species keep their military secrets. Well, secret, that's just standard galactic procedure. You develop advanced tactics and technologies, then you protect them with layers of security protocols and classification systems. The entire concept of sharing combat techniques with potential adversaries violates about 17 different strategic principles that have guided interspecies relations for centuries. Military knowledge represents power, and power gets guarded, not distributed. Earth established what they called the Human Initiative, an open exchange program for galactic observers that turned conventional wisdom upside down. Instead of tightening security around their revolutionary combat techniques, they invited species from across the galaxy to come study their methods. They set up training facilities, published technical manuals, and conducted live demonstrations of everything from Pattern 7 coordination to their medical assistance protocols. This wasn't just sharing information, it was complete operational transparency. They invited species from across the galaxy to learn how humans train to resolve disputes non-destructively. The initiative offered courses on everything from ethical decision-making frameworks to the mathematical models behind their precision targeting systems. Observers could study their communication protocols, their damage control procedures, even their psychological profiling techniques for understanding opponent motivations. The humans treated military knowledge as something to be shared rather than hoarded. Commander Anderson rose to lead Earth's Interstellar Relations Division, embedding their philosophy at the highest levels of diplomatic engagement. His promotion from military command to diplomatic leadership signaled how seriously the humans took this integration of their conflict resolution principles into broader interspecies relations. He brought the same clinical precision to diplomacy that he'd demonstrated in combat, treating political negotiations as another form of strategic engagement requiring the same disciplined approach. They shared everything from Pattern 7 coordination algorithms to their ethical decision-making frameworks without reservation. The technical specifications for their synchronization systems, the medical protocols for treating enemy casualties, the psychological profiles for de-escalation techniques, all became available through the initiative's open database. This level of transparency was either brilliant diplomacy or catastrophic naivety, depending on which admiral you asked during the initial briefings. The broader claim crystallized across the galactic community. There is a better way than endless cycles of destruction and revenge. This simple statement began appearing in diplomatic communications, military academy curricula, and interspecies negotiation protocols. The humans had demonstrated that conflict resolution could achieve more sustainable outcomes through restraint and precision rather than overwhelming force. Their approach offered an alternative to the familiar pattern of victory leading to resentment, leading to future conflict. Other civilizations began adopting what they called constructive conflict resolution, techniques based on human principles. Military academies started incorporating Pattern 7 concepts into their tactical training, though most species struggled to achieve the same level of coordination. Medical Corps developed cross-species treatment protocols modeled after human emergency response procedures. Diplomatic services began training negotiators in the kind of psychological engagement techniques the humans had used with Admiral Korath. The initiative's impact extended beyond military applications into broader interspecies relations. Trade agreements began incorporating conflict resolution mechanisms based on human mediation principles. Cultural exchange programs adopted their techniques for overcoming communication barriers and misunderstanding. Even scientific collaboration started using their framework for managing disagreements about research methodologies and data interpretation. This transparency created unexpected diplomatic advantages for humanity. Their willingness to share knowledge built trust across species that had previously viewed each other with suspicion. It positioned them as neutral mediators in conflicts where they had no direct stake. It demonstrated confidence in their methods without requiring demonstrations of destructive capability. Their openness became a strategic asset rather than a vulnerability. The galactic community's response shifted from skepticism to cautious adoption as more species experimented with human techniques. The initial concerns about security risks gradually gave way to recognition of the practical benefits. Even traditional adversaries found value in approaches that could resolve disputes without catastrophic losses. The human philosophy of winning without destroying began influencing military doctrine beyond Earth's immediate sphere of influence, which brings us to the tangible shifts across multiple empires that would have seemed impossible before the human initiative launched. The demonstration effect of their approach started creating ripple effects through galactic politics and military strategy that reached far beyond what anyone could have predicted from a single engagement against the hegemony fleet. The humans had started something that was beginning to reshape how entire civilizations thought about power and conflict. The hegemony of Claw hadn't voluntarily engaged in peace talks in 3 centuries. That's longer than some species' recorded histories. They built empires, fought wars, and established entire colonial networks in less time than the hegemony spent avoiding diplomacy. Their entire foreign policy could be summarized as negotiate only after conquest, which isn't really negotiation at all. They viewed peaceful engagement as weakness, compromise as failure, and dialogue as something you do with subordinates, not equals. Within 2 standard cycles of the battle, they requested formal peaceful engagement with Earth. The transmission came through official channels with proper diplomatic protocols, not the usual demands or threats. The message contained no conditions, no attempts to save face, no subtle implications of future retribution. It simply requested a meeting to discuss mutual understanding and future relations, which from the hegemony might as well have been a declaration of philosophical revolution. Their military doctrine shifted from total domination to what they called measured response. This wasn't just semantics. They rewrote their tactical manuals, retrained their officers, and restructured their fleet deployments. The new doctrine emphasized precision over power, containment over destruction, and de-escalation over escalation. They started evaluating engagements based on minimum necessary force rather than maximum achievable damage. This represented the most significant doctrinal shift in their military history. Admiral Karath himself became an advocate for studying human tactical philosophy. The same officer who had delivered the surrender ultimatum with imperial certainty now lectured his peers about the strategic value of restraint. He established research divisions dedicated to analyzing human conflict resolution techniques and adapting them to hegemony operations. His conversion from hardline traditionalist to reform advocate signaled how profoundly the engagement had affected their leadership. The hegemony actually returned to Earth to apologize and discuss mutual defense agreements. Their delegation arrived without the usual military escorts or shows of force. They offered formal apologies for the attack, acknowledged their miscalculation, and proposed collaborative security arrangements that would protect both systems from external threats. This transition from aggressor to potential ally happened faster than most species changed their messaging protocols. This wasn't surrender, it was what humans called constructive engagement between former adversaries. The humans treated the hegemony not as a defeated enemy, but as a potential partner who had made strategic errors. They focused on building future cooperation rather than punishing past aggression. The discussion centered on shared interest, common threats, and collaborative solutions rather than reparations or concessions. Their entire concept of power shifted from capacity to destroy to ability to protect without becoming the threat. This philosophical transformation affected everything from military strategy to domestic policy. They started evaluating their actions based on whether they created stability or conflict, whether they built trust or fear, whether they solved problems or created new ones. This represented a fundamental rethinking of what strength actually means in interspecies relations. What made the hegemony abandon aggressive expansion after centuries of successful conquest? They'd experienced defeat without destruction, and it offered a path forward that didn't require endless vengeance cycles. The humans had demonstrated that losing didn't have to mean annihilation, that conflict could end without creating permanent enemies, that security could be achieved through cooperation rather than domination. This alternative approach appealed to their strategic thinking more than their pride resisted it. The humans' assistance after the battle played a crucial role in this shift. Providing medical care and repairs to disabled ships showed that strength could include compassion, rather than require cruelty. This demonstration of what they called strategic empathy proved more persuasive than any military victory could have been. It convinced the hegemony that the humans represented not just tactical innovation, but philosophical advancement. At the time, I thought it was temporary, a brief moment of reconsideration before they returned to their established patterns. A tactical pause rather than a strategic shift. The professional observer in me had seen species change their behavior under pressure, only to revert when circumstances changed. I assumed the hegemony would eventually resume their expansionist policies once they recovered from the shock of their unconventional defeat. Then the Spiral Federation followed suit, and I realized this wasn't an isolated case of temporary reconsideration. Another major power began adopting elements of human conflict resolution, then another, until what started as a single battle's aftermath began influencing galactic relations on a scale nobody could have predicted. The demonstration effect of the human approach was creating ripple effects that reached far beyond Earth's immediate sphere of influence. Look, when one empire changes its philosophy, it's interesting. When multiple do, it's a movement. The Spiral Federation and Crystal Collective moved toward peace treaties rooted in human-style mediation, after centuries of intermittent conflict. Their negotiations stopped focusing on territorial concessions and started addressing the underlying causes of their disputes. They began using human techniques for de-escalation and mutual understanding rather than traditional power-based bargaining. The Shard Empire began experimenting with victory without destruction as a new strategic concept in their military exercises. They started training their forces to achieve objectives through precision and control, rather than overwhelming force. Their tactical simulations shifted from maximizing enemy casualties to minimizing collateral damage, while still achieving mission success. This represented a fundamental rethinking of military effectiveness from one of the galaxy's most traditionally aggressive powers. Multiple species adopted variations of Pattern 7 for disaster response and search and rescue operations. The coordination techniques humans developed for combat proved equally valuable for coordinating emergency services during natural disasters and spacecraft accidents. The precise synchronization and situational awareness that made Pattern 7 effective in battle helped rescue teams work together more efficiently during crises. What began as a military innovation became a tool for saving lives across different emergency scenarios. The galactic power dynamic shifted from conquest toward what humans called cooperative growth under pressure. Species began viewing conflicts as problems to solve together, rather than competitions to win. The focus moved from dominating others to creating systems where multiple civilizations could thrive simultaneously. This didn't eliminate competition, but it changed the nature of that competition from destructive to constructive. This wasn't utopia. Conflicts still occurred, but the resolution methods had fundamentally changed. Disputes that would have previously led to military engagements now often ended with mediated settlements. The human approach provided tools for de-escalating tensions before they turned violent. Even when conflicts did turn physical, the participants increasingly aimed for measured responses rather than maximum destruction. The human philosophy of restraint and proportional response became a studied discipline across military academies. Command schools started offering courses on conflict resolution techniques that emphasized understanding opponent motivations. Tactical training incorporated exercises focused on achieving objectives with minimal force. Officer education began, including psychological and sociological components that had previously been considered irrelevant to military science. The institutional adoption of these principles ensured they would influence future generations of military leaders. Cadets learned to evaluate success not just by battles won, but by conflicts resolved sustainably. They studied historical examples where overwhelming force had created long-term problems despite short-term victories. The curriculum emphasized that true, strategic thinking involved considering consequences. Beyond immediate tactical outcomes, the galaxy was learning to share space and power through learning and restraint rather than annihilation. Species began recognizing that security could be achieved through cooperation rather than domination. The human demonstration that strength involved control rather than destruction resonated across cultural boundaries. This shift represented perhaps the most significant change in interspecies relations since the development of functional faster-than-light travel. The transformation wasn't uniform or instantaneous. Some species adopted the principles more completely than others. Certain military traditions resisted changing established doctrines, but the overall direction moved toward greater emphasis on measured responses and conflict resolution. The human example provided a viable alternative to the cycle of violence that had characterized galactic relations for centuries. The practical impact of these changes became visible in reduced casualty rates during conflicts and faster recovery times afterward. Medical services reported fewer catastrophic injuries in combat situations. Reconstruction efforts became more efficient when infrastructure remained largely intact. The economic costs of conflicts decreased significantly when they didn't involve total destruction of assets and resources. This shift toward more measured conflict resolution created conditions for greater interstellar cooperation in other areas. Scientific collaboration increased as species became more willing to share knowledge. Trade networks expanded as trust between civilizations grew. Cultural exchanges became more common as fear of exploitation diminished. The changes in military philosophy rippled through all aspects of galactic society, which brings us to my current unusual assignment, where I find myself explaining human philosophy to military commanders who still think power means how much you can destroy. In 17 years of observing galactic conflicts, I never imagined I'd transition from battlefield documentation to, whatever this strange new role represents. My credentials as a senior combat analysis specialist for the Galactic Peacekeeping Coalition somehow qualified me to become chief liaison for Earth's Human Initiative, which mostly involves explaining human philosophy to extremely skeptical military commanders. The career shift feels less like promotion and more like being reassigned from watching explosions to explaining why fireworks are fundamentally misunderstood. My current assignment involves conveying paradigm shifting ideas to a galaxy built on centuries of fear and domination. I spend my days in strategic briefings with admirals who measure strength by megatonnage and victory by casualty ratios. They listen to my explanations about human conflict resolution with the polite patience one reserves for someone describing their dream from last night. The cultural gap between established military traditions and human philosophy might as well be the distance. Between spiral arms, I constantly explain that the human approach isn't about weakness. It's about completely redefining what strength means. They've demonstrated that power can manifest through precision rather than destruction, through control rather than chaos, through preservation rather than annihilation. This conceptual shift challenges everything military academies have taught for generations, trying to explain that defeating an enemy without destroying them represents superior capability rather than compromised victory requires fundamentally reconsidering basic assumptions about conflict. The work progresses with frustrating slowness and frequently meets what humans call institutional resistance. Military organizations develop traditions and doctrines over centuries, and they don't abandon them because one species demonstrated an alternative approach. The resistance isn't malicious. It's the natural inertia of established systems that have functioned adequately for generations. Changing how entire civilizations think about power and conflict requires working through layers of bureaucratic tradition and cultural conditioning. We openly acknowledge that this new galactic order represents a work in progress rather than a finished solution. The human approach continues evolving as more species contribute their perspectives and adaptations. Nobody claims to have perfected conflict resolution. They simply demonstrated that alternatives exist to the cycle of destruction and retaliation that has characterized galactic relations. The initiative focuses on continuous improvement, rather than claiming to possess final answers. As the humans themselves say with characteristic bluntness, is it easy? Hell no. Is it always successful? Of course not. They approach this philosophical shift with realistic expectations rather than idealistic dreams. Some species adapt their techniques successfully, others struggle with implementation, and a few reject the concepts entirely. The humans measure progress in small increments rather than expecting immediate transformation across the galaxy. Why? Would someone who spent 17 years documenting traditional warfare now believe humans discovered something genuinely galaxy-changing? Because the evidence demonstrates that their approach creates more sustainable outcomes than conventional military doctrine. Species that adopt elements of their philosophy experience fewer conflicts, faster recovery from engagements, and more stable long-term relationships. The data shows measurable improvements in interspecies relations. Where their principles get implemented, the pattern continues. Holding across multiple civilizations, species are gradually learning that true power lies not in domination, but in willingness to change. The humans prove that flexibility and adaptation represent greater strengths than rigid adherence to traditional power structures. Their most significant contribution might be demonstrating that reassessing fundamental assumptions requires courage rather than weakness. At the time I received that initial observation assignment, I believed I was documenting another species extinction for the Galactic Archives. Now I find myself helping spread what might be their most dangerous idea: that conflict resolution doesn't have to mean destruction, that strength can include compassion, that victory can be measured by what you preserve rather than what you eliminate. The humans didn't just win a battle against the hegemony fleet. They started a philosophical confrontation that's still reshaping how the galaxy understands power itself. Look, I'm going to level with you. The galaxy may never fully adopt human philosophy. Centuries of fear-based military strategies don't just disappear because one species demonstrates a better approach. The institutional inertia of traditional power structures, the deeply ingrained patterns of conquest and retaliation, the entire cultural heritage of equating strength with destructive capability. These things don't reform overnight because of one remarkable engagement. The resistance isn't malicious. It's just the natural tendency of established systems to maintain their familiar patterns. But the humans prove something profoundly important: that conflict resolution can be fundamentally reimagined on a galactic scale. They demonstrated that the established patterns of interspecies warfare weren't inevitable laws of nature, but choices that could be reconsidered. Their approach challenged the assumption that military superiority must manifest through overwhelming destruction rather than precise control. This wasn't just tactical innovation. It was philosophical revolution disguised as combat doctrine. Their greatest strength wasn't in destruction, but in something far more subtle and dangerous: the willingness to help others change. This represented a complete inversion of traditional power dynamics. Instead of forcing compliance through threats and violence, they created conditions where transformation became desirable. They proved that influencing another civilization's development required understanding them better than they understood themselves. This approach treated conflict as an opportunity for mutual growth rather than domination. They demonstrated that you can defend without becoming the thing you oppose, that victory doesn't require annihilation. Their engagement with the hegemony fleet showed that military success could be measured by preservation rather than destruction. They achieved complete tactical supremacy while leaving enemy ships intact and crews alive. This required greater skill and precision than traditional combat, proving that restraint demanded more capability than unleashed violence. The human saying about violence being incompetent: they're trying to prove themselves competent in new ways that don't involve maximum force application. Their approach treats conflict resolution as a skill to be mastered, rather than a contest to be won. They've shifted the measurement of competence from destructive capacity to constructive outcomes. This redefinition of what constitutes effectiveness in military engagements challenges centuries of established doctrine across multiple civilizations. This isn't about making the galaxy peaceful, it's about making conflict constructive rather than destructive. The humans recognize that disagreements and competing interests will always exist between species. Their approach focuses on managing these inevitable conflicts in ways that create value rather than destroy it. They've developed techniques for turning confrontations into opportunities for problem-solving rather than occasions for demonstrating superiority. This pragmatic approach acknowledges that perfect harmony is unrealistic, while proving that catastrophic destruction is unnecessary. What represents the ultimate takeaway from humanity's impossible victory? The demonstration that power can be exercised through precision rather than brute force, through understanding rather than intimidation, through creation rather than destruction. Their approach proves that true strength involves controlling outcomes without maximal violence, achieving objectives while preserving value, and defeating adversaries without creating permanent enemies. This represents not just tactical superiority, but philosophical advancement. The humans were right. There is a better way, and it starts with reimagining what power actually means. Their greatest contribution might be demonstrating that strength isn't about how much you can destroy, but about how much you can preserve while still achieving your objectives. This shift in perspective from destructive capacity to constructive capability offers a path forward that doesn't require endless cycles of retaliation and resentment. It provides an alternative to the familiar pattern, where today's victory plants the seeds for tomorrow's conflict. Which brings us to why this matters for all of us. Right now, regardless of which species we belong to or what role we play in galactic affairs, the human demonstration that conflict can be resolved through means other than overwhelming force offers hope for a more sustainable future. Their approach provides tools for breaking the cycle of violence that has characterized interspecies relations for centuries. This isn't about adopting their methods exactly, but about recognizing that alternatives exist to the patterns we've accepted as inevitable. The humans didn't just win a battle against impossible odds, they demonstrated that the cosmos itself could be reimagined through peaceful encounters. Their approach proved that conflict resolution doesn't require annihilation, that strength can manifest through restraint rather than destruction. If a species as young as humanity can redefine interstellar engagement on this fundamental level, perhaps we all need to reconsider what's truly possible in how civilizations interact. Sometimes the most impossible achievement isn't surviving overwhelming force, but fundamentally changing what survival means for everyone involved in the conflict. You know, when they sent me to observe humanity's final stand against the hegemony fleet, I expected another routine orbital bombardment. What I witnessed instead made me question 17 years of galactic military observation. The humans didn't fight like any species I'd ever seen. They performed something called Pattern 7, and it completely rewrote the rules of space combat. You know, after 17 years of watching species wipe each other out, you develop certain expectations. My observation assignment for Earth's so-called last stand felt like filling out paperwork more than anything else. The kind of bureaucratic routine that makes you question your career choices. The hegemony's third assault fleet had 47 warships bearing down on 12 human vessels. They had 3 dreadnoughts in that formation, each capable of turning continents into molten glass from high orbit. The math here wasn't complicated. This wasn't a battle, it was just scheduled demolition with extra steps. I'd personally documented 17 similar scenarios across 6 different spiral arms. Every single one followed the same pattern: initial resistance followed by desperation, followed by surrender negotiations, concluded by orbital bombardment. The Galactic Observation Manual even has specific forms for this exact situation. Form 7B, planetary subjugation complete, with checkboxes for whether they surrendered promptly or made it messy. My only real concern was whether the humans would extend the inevitable, with some dramatic last stand that would mean more. Paperwork for me. Most species try to negotiate better terms or make grand speeches about their doomed civilization. Some attempt desperate attacks that accomplish nothing beyond increasing the casualty reports. The professional standards of centuries of galactic conflict observation had taught me exactly how this would unfold, and Earth looked like it would be no different from all the others. The entire engagement appeared completely predictable, right up until the moment I had to start questioning everything in my training.
Manuals. This was supposed to be another routine documentation
Of superior force overwhelming inferior numbers. Another case study for the archives showing that military technology and fleet size ultimately determine outcomes. The detachment that comes from watching 17 species meet their end was about to collide with something my classification systems couldn't process. All the standardized observation protocols, all the established patterns of interspecies conflict resolution. None of it prepared me for what happened when the human commander finally opened his mouth to respond to the surrender ultimatum. That moment when he started speaking was when I realized this might not follow any of the established patterns after all. Look, Admiral Korath's surrender ultimatum was textbook perfection, exactly what the situation demanded. He delivered his terms with that particular blend of condescension and finality that normally breaks species within minutes. Most civilizations start begging for mercy or making desperate counteroffers at that point. The standard operating procedure here is pure psychological pressure, and the hegemony has refined it over centuries of successful conquests. They know exactly how much threat projection to use against how much resistance potential, and the math here clearly indicated total submission was the only logical response. Instead of the expected panic or defiance, Commander Anderson responded with what sounded like genuine boredom. His tone carried the weary patience of someone explaining basic arithmetic to a slow student for the third time. He began by reading back the enemy's complete fleet composition with unsettling precision. 3 dreadnoughts, 18 battle cruisers, 12 destroyers, all correct. Then he mentioned the 14 support vessels that most species completely miss in their terror-induced scanning. Logistic ships, medical frigates, reconnaissance drones, the kind of assets that never appear in initial threat assessments because everyone's too busy counting the big guns. Then he did something no species had ever done in a surrender negotiation. He asked for detailed casualty data from the hegemony's previous 3 engagements in this sector. Not just rough estimates, but specific numbers on crew losses, ship recovery rates, and even post-battle salvage statistics. This wasn't bravado or stalling. It was clinical, almost academic interest in the mathematics of destruction. He sounded like a researcher comparing data sets rather than a commander facing annihilation. The surrender negotiation abruptly transformed into a tactical debate about fleet efficiency metrics. Anderson started questioning the hegemony's casualty-to-victory ratios, their repair timelines after similar engagements, even their supply chain vulnerabilities during extended campaigns. For the first time in my observational career, I saw a hegemony admiral rendered completely speechless. Korath's confident posture actually faltered as he tried to process why the human commander cared about logistical data when his entire civilization was about to be extinguished. At the time, I assumed this was just some elaborate form of delayed panic. Perhaps the humans had finally cracked under pressure and were engaging in meaningless tactical analysis as a coping mechanism. I'd seen species do stranger things when facing certain doom. Some try to negotiate better burial customs, others attempt to record final messages for posterity. This seemed like another variation of that same desperate pattern, intellectual displacement instead of emotional breakdown. The professional observer in me started making notes about human psychological responses to extreme stress, completely missing what was actually happening. You know what species usually do before certain death? They pray to their various deities. They record final messages for their offspring. They prepare for martyrdom with solemn ceremonies. I've watched entire civilizations face their end with everything from dignified acceptance to screaming panic. But I'd never seen what the humans did next. While the hegemony fleet powered their primary weapons and calculated optimal bombardment patterns, the human command channels lit up with what sounded like academic debate. They weren't discussing escape routes or surrender terms. They were arguing historical ship formations like chess enthusiasts analyzing classic games. One officer was explaining some ancient Earth concept called asymmetric warfare tactics, while another crew member corrected his historical dates. They sounded less like warriors facing annihilation, and more like university students preparing for a final exam. The communication channels buzzed with impromptu trivia contests about historical Earth battles. Crew members were quizzing each other on tactical details from conflicts that happened centuries before spaceflight. They debated the merits of different defensive formations with the casual energy of friends planning a weekend outing, rather than military personnel about to engage a superior force. This collective preparation had none of the grim desperation I'd come to expect from species in their position. They weren't just sharing information, they were cross-training each other in real time. Engineering teams were explaining system limitations to tactical officers. Navigation specialists were teaching weapons crews about spatial mechanics. The entire fleet functioned like a single distributed classroom, where every member was both student and instructor simultaneously. This "we're all in this together" mentality completely lacked the hierarchical rigidity that characterizes most military structures. The most baffling part was how they discussed their own potential casualties. Instead of heroic last stands or sacrifice narratives, They analyzed loss probabilities with clinical detachment. They talked about crew survivability rates, ship integrity thresholds, and recovery scenarios like actuaries calculating insurance risks. One human actually made a joke about their life insurance policies that got genuine laughter across multiple channels. They weren't preparing to die. They were preparing to demonstrate something. The phrase "costly exhibition" started appearing in their communications. This idea that they were about to stage a demonstration of strategic principles rather than fight a conventional battle. They kept referring to teaching the hegemony a lesson about proportional response and tactical innovation.